The chime sounded first. Then the floor dropped out, from under 200 people at 34,000 feet. A woman in seat 14C opened her eyes, before anyone screamed. She was already counting. Engine pitch. The wrong groan in the overhead bins. A wing dipping and dipping, because whoever was up front had stopped flying, and started fighting. Her hand hit the call button. No one else's did. She was in the aisle, before the airframe finished wallowing, jacket still on, a folded letter in the pocket she hadn't opened in 6 weeks. Past the curtain. Past a flight attendant, whose hands had quit working. The cockpit door swung inward, and the noise came out at her with teeth. Alarms. Red light strobing across glass. Copper and sweat. One man slumped against his harness. One man gray, drowning, gripping the yoke, with a hand that had nothing left in it. She dropped into the captain's seat of an aircraft she had never flown in her life, and pulled the straps tight. Quinn Ashford did not sleep on airplanes. Not real sleep. Not since the carrier. She sat in 14C, aisle seat, boots crossed at the ankle, duffel bag wedged, so tight under the seat in front of her, that her knees had gone numb somewhere over Nevada. Her eyes were closed. Her mind was not. Because sleep required trust. And trust required silence. And there was no silence in her head anymore. Just Sutter's voice, looping. Just the sound of a call sign being read off a list of the dead. The overhead lights had dimmed 20 minutes ago. Somewhere behind her a baby was crying in short, exhausted bursts. Somewhere in front of her a man was snoring like a diesel engine trying to turn over in the cold. Normal sounds. Normal flight. Which was the whole problem. Normal was a costume. She was wearing it badly. 6 weeks. 6 weeks since the flight deck. 6 weeks since the wind was wrong, and the horizon was wrong, and every instinct she'd built, over a decade of naval aviation screamed the same word. Wave off. 6 weeks since she'd said that word out loud, into a headset, to a man, who outranked her, and watched him launch anyway. She opened her eyes. The cabin was blue dark, seatback screens glowing like dying stars. Her reflection hung in the window, thin and tired, backlit by nothing. She looked, she thought, like someone who had already lost. The letter was in her jacket pocket. She hadn't taken it out, since the morning it arrived. Didn't need to. She had it memorized the way you memorize a wound, not because you want to, but because your hand keeps finding it. Lieutenant Commander Ashford is directed to appear, before the Board of Inquiry, Naval Air Station Whidbey Island, in connection with the loss of Lieutenant Roy Sutter, and Aircraft 471. Loss. That was the word the Navy used. Loss. As if Roy had simply misplaced himself somewhere, over the Pacific. As if he hadn't augured, into black water at 400 knots, because she'd told him not to fly, and someone above her had told him to fly anyway, and he had chosen, in the end, the uniform over the woman standing beside the catapult telling him the weather was wrong. She closed her eyes again. Didn't help. Because if she was being honest, and 3 in the morning, over the Rockies had a way of making honesty unavoidable, the ghost sitting next to her wasn't Roy Sutter at all. It was his son. She'd seen the boy's photograph once. Just once. Pinned to a corkboard in Sutter's stateroom, half covered by a duty roster. A kid in an academy candidate's uniform, jaw set the exact same stubborn way his father's used to set, eyes doing that thing, where they're trying so hard to look like they don't care what anyone thinks. 18 years old. About to become a Navy man. About to spend the rest of his life believing a story about how his father died. Quinn didn't know what that story was yet. She only knew the board would decide it. And she would be sitting in a windowless room in 6 days, while 9 officers, who had never flown, into a wall of weather at 0 dark 30 decided what her career, her name, and Roy Sutter's memory were worth. She opened her eyes. Because sitting still, with that thought was worse than turbulence. Worse than anything the sky could throw at her. The man beside her, 14B, gray fleece, laptop open to a spreadsheet he wasn't reading, glanced over. Caught her staring at nothing. Cleared his throat the way people do, when they've decided to be friendly, and haven't thought past that decision. Rough flight so far? No, she said. Smooth. You looked like you were somewhere else. I was. He waited for more. She didn't give him more. Eventually he went back to his spreadsheet, and Quinn went back to the window, and the 767 kept eating altitude, and time in equal, indifferent bites. Because that was the thing about grief. It didn't care about cruising altitude. It didn't care about seatbelt signs. It followed you, into pressurized cabins at 34,000 feet, and sat down next to you like it had a boarding pass of its own. She pressed her forehead to the plexiglass. Cold. Real. Something to hold on to. Below, nothing but black. Rockies, probably, jagged and indifferent under a moonless sky. Somewhere down there people were asleep in their beds, unaware that 34,000 feet above them a woman was rehearsing the worst conversation of her life for the 9th time that night. You wave off an aircraft, when the deck's pitching more than 5 degrees. You wave off when crosswind exceeds limits. You wave off, when your gut says something's wrong even, if the instruments say it's fine, because instruments don't have 10 years of muscle memory, and gut does. She'd waved it off. Lieutenant Sutter hadn't. Because Commander Holloway had come on the radio himself, and said the mission clock didn't care about her gut, and Roy, good, dumb, loyal Roy, who'd flown wing on her for 2 deployments, and once talked her down, from a bad landing, with nothing but his voice, and bad jokes, Roy had said yes sir, and gone. And the ocean had taken him whole. The captain's voice broke, through the PA, calm and unhurried, some routine update about cruising altitude, and expected arrival time. Quinn barely registered the words. Her body did the math automatically, altitude, ground speed, time to destination, the way it always did, an old habit, that never switched off no matter what seat she was sitting in. Seattle. 2 hours out. 2 hours until the ground came up to meet her, and the real countdown started. 6 days until the board. 6 days until 9 men, and women in dress uniforms decided whether Roy Sutter died, because of weather, or because of her. She closed her eyes one more time. This time, sleep found her. Not real sleep. The kind that comes, from exhaustion instead of peace. The kind that doesn't rest you, so much as switch you off for a while. She dreamed, briefly, of a flight deck at night. Green glow sticks marking the edges of a world, that ended 20 feet past the catapult. Roy's voice on the radio, laughing at something. And then not laughing. 3 rows up, in seat 9A, a man was awake too. He hadn't slept much on planes in 30 years, not since his own flying days, back when jets were louder, and cockpits smelled like hydraulic fluid, and every landing was an argument you had to win. Elias Marsh had made Rear Admiral, then retired, then discovered that retirement was mostly just having opinions nobody asked for anymore. He was flying to Seattle, because a letter had asked him to. Not asked, really. Summoned. The board respectfully requests your presence, as a character witness in the matter of LCDR Quinn Ashford. He'd read the letter 4 times, before folding it, into his breast pocket. 4 times because the name on it kept refusing to sit still in his memory. Quinn Ashford. His Quinn Ashford. The nugget aviator he'd pulled out of a training squadron 11 years ago, because she flew like she had something to prove, and nothing to lose, which in his experience was the only kind of pilot worth a damn. He had trained her. Signed her fitness reports. Written the recommendation, that got her, onto Hornets in the first place. And now the Navy wanted him to sit in a room and help decide whether she should keep her wings. Because that's the part nobody tells you about mentorship, he thought, staring at the seat back in front of him, without really seeing it. Eventually they hand you a knife, and ask if you're willing to use it on the person you're proudest of. He didn't know the full story. Only the bones of it. A wave-off order, overridden. A pilot lost. An inquiry that smelled, from where he was sitting, less like justice, and more like a service trying to find someone convenient to blame, before the news cycle found someone inconvenient instead. He'd flown with men like Holloway. Men who confused decisiveness with wisdom. Men who'd rather lose an aircraft, and a pilot than admit a call was wrong in real time, in front of witnesses, on the record. Marsh closed his eyes. Didn't sleep. Just sat there in the dark, turning the letter over in his mind like a coin he couldn't decide how to spend. Somewhere behind them, in seat 22F, First Officer Grant Kessler was 3 hours into his rest period, and dead to the world, unaware that in a few hours his right arm would be shattered against a center console at 34,000 feet. And up front, behind a reinforced door, Captain Dale Holbrook was drinking his second cup of coffee, and telling a joke to his first officer, that neither of them would remember by morning. None of them knew yet. That was the thing about disaster. It never announced itself in advance. It just waited, patient and indifferent, somewhere out over the dark curve of the earth, for the moment, when altitude and turbulence, and bad luck all lined up at once. The seatbelt sign chimed on without warning. Quinn's eyes opened before her brain caught up. Old habit. Cockpit reflex, running even in a body strapped into economy class. She registered the sound, before she registered the meaning, a soft two-tone chime, innocuous, almost polite. Then the aircraft dropped. Not a bump. Not the gentle rise and fall of normal chop. A drop. The kind that pulls your stomach up, into your throat, and leaves it there, hovering, while your body tries to remember which way is down. Somewhere behind her a woman screamed, short and sharp, cut off by her own hand clamping over her mouth. The man in 14B, Warren, according to the boarding pass sticking out of his jacket pocket, grabbed the armrest, so hard his knuckles went white. "What was that?" he said. Not really a question. More like a demand the universe had no intention of answering. Quinn didn't answer either. She was already listening. Not to him. To the aircraft. Because a pilot never really stops being a pilot, even in seat 14C, even 6 weeks removed from a flight deck that still haunted her dreams. Her ears were already cataloging the sounds. Engine pitch. Airframe stress. The specific groan of overhead bins under structural load that shouldn't be there. The plane leveled. Barely. Wobbled instead of settling, like a boxer who's taken a hit, and is still deciding whether to go down. Clear air turbulence, she muttered, mostly to herself. How do you know that? Because I know what it sounds like, when a wing loses lift for no reason. She kept her eyes forward. And I know what it sounds like, when the person flying doesn't correct for it right. Warren stared at her. You're not supposed to say things like that on an airplane. I'm not supposed to notice things like that on an airplane, Quinn said. Too late for both. The aircraft banked. Hard. Harder than it should have. The left wing dipped in a way that made overhead compartments swing, and a flight attendant 3 rows up stagger sideways, into a seatback, catching herself with both hands. Because a proper recovery from turbulence is smooth. Controlled. A pilot levels the wings, eases the nose, lets the airframe breathe. This wasn't that. This was overcorrection. Panic in the yoke. Someone up front fighting the airplane instead of flying it. Quinn's spine went rigid. Every cell in her body, that had spent a decade strapped into an ejection seat came fully, violently online. Something's wrong, she said quietly. No kidding, Warren snapped, still gripping the armrest. No. I mean something's wrong. Up front. She looked toward the curtain separating economy from the forward cabin, as if she could see through fabric and bulkheads by sheer force of attention. That's not how you recover from a wind shear. That's someone flying scared. The PA crackled. Nothing. Just static, and the specific silence of a system someone had keyed, and then hadn't spoken into yet. Because that silence was the worst sound of all. Silence after a chime means someone up front is deciding what to say. Which means what they're about to say is bad. The chime came again. 2 tones, urgent this time. Not the gentle boarding announcement kind. The kind flight attendants use when they need each other, fast, no pleasantries. Then a voice. Female. Breathless in a way that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with fear, held one syllable away from breaking. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the lead flight attendant. We are experiencing a medical emergency in the cockpit. Quinn's stomach dropped lower than the turbulence had taken it. If there are any military pilots on board, please ring your call button. The cabin went silent in a way Quinn had heard only twice before in her life, once on a flight deck, after an arresting cable snapped, once in a ready room, after a name was read off a list that shouldn't have had a name on it yet. Because that kind of silence isn't peace. It's 200 people doing the same math at the same time, and not liking the answer. She sat very still. No, she thought. Absolutely not. Not me. I fly fighters. I've never touched a heavy transport in my life. There will be someone else. There's always someone else. A retired airline captain. A cargo pilot. Someone who actually knows what a 767 sounds like when it's happy. 5 seconds passed. She counted them, the way she counted seconds on final approach. No amber light lit up anywhere in the cabin. 10 seconds. The aircraft dipped again, an ugly uncoordinated shudder that sent a drink cart careening into a seatback 3 rows up. Somewhere a child was crying. Somewhere a man was praying out loud, quietly, in a language Quinn didn't recognize, but understood completely. Because whoever's up there is losing. That's not weather anymore. That's a pilot who's running out of what he's got left to give. 15 seconds. Someone else will do it. Someone else has to do it. She thought of Roy. Thought of the board waiting for her in 6 days. Thought of a boy at the academy, who was about to lose the last shred of certainty he had left about his father, unless someone somewhere started making the right calls again. And maybe that was the thing nobody tells you about carrying guilt around for 6 weeks. Eventually it stops being a weight you drag behind you. It starts being a hand pushing you forward, whether you want to go or not. Her arm moved, before the rest of her had finished arguing about it. She pressed the call button. The soft amber light clicked on above 14C, and it felt, absurdly, like the entire aircraft had turned to look at her, even though nobody could have possibly known. Warren's mouth fell open. You're a pilot. Navy, Quinn said, and her voice came out flatter and steadier than she felt, because that was the trick, that had always been the trick. You didn't have to feel calm. You just had to sound like you did, until your body caught up with the lie. She unclipped her seatbelt. Let me out. He scrambled his legs sideways, so fast he nearly hit his own laptop off the tray table. Quinn stepped into the aisle, duffel bag left behind, jacket still on, heart already running somewhere ahead of the rest of her body toward a cockpit she'd never flown, and a job she'd never trained for. Because there wasn't time to be afraid of that yet. That would come later. Right now there was only forward. The curtain to the forward cabin parted, before she reached it. A flight attendant, young, dark hair coming loose, from its bun, a stain of spilled coffee soaking one hip of her uniform skirt, practically fell through the gap. "You rang," the woman said, eyes wide, voice cracking on the second word. "Ashford. Navy. Fighters." Quinn kept her voice low, level, the way she'd learned to talk to junior pilots mid-emergency, back when calm was the only thing you had left to give someone who was drowning. "Panic doesn't help anyone up there. Tell me what's happening." The woman, Wren, her name tag read, though Quinn barely registered it, grabbed Quinn's wrist. A breach of every protocol Quinn assumed existed for exactly this reason, and neither of them cared. "This way. Please. Please hurry." They moved through first class together, past a row of wide, frightened eyes belonging to people who had paid extra for legroom, and gotten a front row seat to a nightmare instead. Quinn didn't look at any of them. Her mind had already started doing the thing it used to do on the flight deck, closing doors on everything that wasn't the mission, one by one, until there was nothing left but the next 30 seconds. At the forward galley, a man in a purser's uniform stood frozen by the cockpit door, phone in hand, face the color of old paper. "Declan," Wren said. "This is Lieutenant Commander Ashford," Quinn said. "Navy. What do we have?" Declan blinked at her like she'd spoken a foreign language, then seemed to remember how his own voice worked. "Severe clear air turbulence. No warning." The flight deck crew they were off harness, having a meal. "How bad?" Captain Holbrook hit the overhead panel. "He's unconscious." First Officer Kessler, his arm, Declan's hand shook, as he gestured vaguely at his own forearm, unable to finish the sentence. "Broken," Quinn finished for him. "He's flying with one hand. He said the autopilot disconnected in the drop, and he can't get it back online, and because that explains the overcorrection. That explains the sloppy bank, the panicked nose up, the whole airframe wallowing like a wounded animal." A man with a broken arm, and a concussion adjacent to his own fear, hand-flying 200 tons of metal, through open sky. "Open it," Quinn said. Declan's fingers fumbled the keypad twice, before the code took. The heavy door clicked, and swung inward, and the sound hit first, a shrill, repetitive whine, master caution, insistent and merciless. Then the light, red and amber strobing across glass panels like a fire trying to communicate in Morse code. Then the smell. Copper. Sweat. Fear, if fear had a smell, and Quinn had long ago decided it did. Captain Holbrook slumped against his harness on the left, a dark gash above his eyebrow leaking blood down the side of his face, unmoving. On the right, First Officer Kessler was gray, drenched in sweat, right arm hanging at an angle that made Quinn's own shoulder ache in sympathy. His left hand was locked around the yoke in a death grip, eyes blown wide, and fixed on the artificial horizon like it was the only solid thing left in the universe. "Kessler," Quinn said, stepping in, pulling the door shut behind her without thinking. He didn't react. She snapped her hand down flat against the glare shield, right in his line of sight. "Kessler. Look at me." He flinched. The yoke jerked with him. The whole aircraft tipped left, and Quinn grabbed the back of the jump seat to keep from falling into him. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Ashford," she said, louder now, cutting through the alarm. "United States Navy. I fly fighters. I'm taking the left seat. I've got you." "The trim," he gasped. "I can't reach the trim." "I know. Hold it 10 more seconds. That's all I need." He nodded, or tried to, the motion small and desperate. Quinn turned to Declan, still hovering white-faced in the doorway. "Get the captain out. Now. Careful with his neck." It was ugly work, Declan, and Wren hauling Holbrook's dead weight backward, over the center console, Quinn helping brace him, blood smearing warm, and wet across her forearm, before they finally got him clear, into the galley. Someone shut the cockpit door behind them, and then it was just Quinn, and Kessler, and 200 tons of metal, that had no idea it was currently being flown by a woman, who had never once touched its controls, before this exact moment. She slid into the captain's seat. Because the first thing you notice, in a chair like this, is how big everything is. The yoke. The panel. The whole architecture of the cockpit built for a different kind of flying than the one she knew, big sweeping inputs instead of the fingertip precision of a fighter stick, whole arm leverage instead of wrist and thumb. She pulled the 5-point harness tighter, until the straps bit into her collarbone. The pressure helped. Pain was a language she understood better than fear. Kessler. She wrapped both hands around the yoke's heavy black horns. I have the aircraft. You have the aircraft, he repeated, and something in him broke open, with relief, his good hand finally letting go, the shattered arm cradled against his ribs, as his head fell back against the seat. The artificial horizon was tilted, nose pitched up too far, airspeed bleeding away in slow, dangerous increments. Somewhere in the back of Quinn's mind, a mantra surfaced, old and automatic, drilled into her a decade ago in a training squadron by a man, whose name she hadn't let herself think about in years. Aviate. Navigate. Communicate. Aviate first. Always first. She eased the yoke forward. Fed power into the throttles, with her right hand, and felt the engines answer a full second later than she expected, sluggish, massive, nothing like the immediate violence of an F-18 spooling up. Because this isn't a fighter. This is a truck. A beautiful, terrifying truck, and every instinct you've spent 10 years building is about to be wrong in 100 small ways, before it's right in the one way that matters. She banked left, correcting, feeling the aircraft respond like it was arguing with her the whole way. The horizon leveled. Slowly. Reluctantly. She held it there, let the airspeed climb back, into something resembling safe, eased the throttles back, and reached up to silence the master caution. The cabin went quiet. Not silent, never silent, not with the wind screaming past the windscreen at cruise speed, but quiet in the way that mattered. Controlled. Held. Kessler's breathing was shallow and fast beside her. Not good. Not good at all. Stay with me, Quinn said, without looking at him, eyes locked on the instruments. Where are we? Seattle Center, he managed. Frequencies, it's dialed in already. She found the radio panel, the push-to-talk switch on the yoke, and keyed it, with a hand, that was, she noticed distantly, not quite steady. Seattle Center, this is heavy, she glanced at the placard on the dash. Heavy 442. Declaring an emergency. Both flight crew incapacitated. I am a non-revenue military pilot. I have taken control of the aircraft. A beat of static. Then a voice, calm in the particular, practiced way of a man, whose entire job existed to sound calm in exactly this moment. Heavy 442, Seattle Center. Copy your emergency. Radar contact. What is your experience on this airframe? Quinn's jaw tightened. 0, she said. I've never flown a 767 in my life. The silence on the other end lasted exactly, as long as it took for someone, somewhere on the ground, to understand what that meant and start moving very fast to find her help. Because 200 people were about to find out, one way or another, whether the woman in seat 14C who'd never wanted anyone to look at her twice was about to become the only reason any of them made it home. 3 rows back, from where Quinn's empty seat now sat, Elias Marsh had watched the entire sequence unfold, with a cold, sinking recognition he hadn't felt in years, not since the day he'd read a casualty report, with a familiar name on it, and understood, all at once, that the war had finally reached in, and touched someone he'd trained personally. He hadn't recognized her right away. Not in the dark, not in civilian clothes, not with her hair down instead of pinned back under a flight cap. But when she stood, when she moved, into the aisle, with that particular economy of motion, no wasted gesture, no hesitation, something in his chest had gone very still. Ashford. He was on his feet, before he'd fully decided to be. An old man's knees protesting an old man's hurry, hand braced against seatbacks, as he pushed forward against the tide of frightened passengers craning to see what was happening. "Sir." A flight attendant, younger, put a hand flat against his chest, stopping him at the first-class curtain. "I need you to return to your seat." "I know that pilot," Marsh said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "I trained her. I need to know what's happening up there." "Sir, please." "I'm a retired Rear Admiral, United States Navy," he said, and something in the flatness of it made the young woman pause, recalculate, reconsider whether the rules applied the same way to a 71-year-old man, with that particular tone in his voice. "I am not going to interfere. I am asking you to tell me what is happening to Lieutenant Commander Ashford." The flight attendant hesitated. Then, quietly, "She has control of the aircraft. Both pilots are down. She's talking to air traffic control now." Marsh closed his eyes. Because there it was. The universe's particular, cruel sense of humor. A woman on her way to a hearing, that might end her career, about to spend the next 30 minutes proving, in the most literal way possible, exactly what she was capable of, and no one on that board would ever know. No one would ever put this in a report. Unless he made sure they did. He didn't go back to his seat right away. He stood there at the curtain's edge, an old aviator listening to a young flight attendant relay fragments of radio chatter she barely understood, and felt something shift inside him, that he hadn't expected to feel again at his age. Not pride, exactly. Not yet. Something rawer than that. Fear. For her. Real, uncomplicated fear, the kind he hadn't let himself feel in decades, because feeling it had never once helped anyone land a jet. Because Elias Marsh had spent 6 weeks quietly, privately, believing the Navy was about to make a terrible mistake, with Quinn Ashford's career. And now the universe had arranged, with its usual indifference to convenience, to prove him right in the worst possible classroom, 34,000 feet, over the Cascades, in front of 200 strangers, who would never understand what they were watching. He made his way back to his seat. Saturday. Buckled the belt, with hands that weren't quite steady either, for all his decades of training. And waited. Because there was nothing else left to do. Nothing except sit in the dark, and listen to the engines, and hope that whatever Quinn Ashford had left in her, whatever had made him pull her out of a training squadron 11 years ago, and put his own name on the line to get her, onto fighters, was still there. Still enough. Up front, Quinn had no idea any of that was happening behind her. There was no room in her for it. There was only the panel, the yoke, the radio, and the slow, deliberate work of not dying. Heavy 442, this is Captain Jim Whitfield, Boeing Flight Standards. I understand we've got a Navy pilot in the left seat today. The voice came, through steady, unhurried, the particular cadence of a man, who had spent a career solving other people's worst days, over a radio frequency, and had learned, somewhere along the way, that panic was contagious, and calm was too. That's affirmative, Quinn said. Lieutenant Commander Quinn Ashford. 2,000 hours in F divided by a -18s. Exactly 0 in a heavy transport. Copy that, Commander. First things first. Let's get the robot flying for you. Because that was the phrase that would stay with her later, long after this flight was over, the robot. Like the aircraft was a stubborn, oversized pet that just needed the right command to settle down. Look at the panel right in front of you, Whitfield said. Center console, glare shield level. You're looking for 2 buttons, marked CMD-A and CMD-B. That's your autopilot engage. Quinn scanned the wall of switches and dials, foreign in a way that made her chest tighten despite herself. 10 years of muscle memory, and none of it applied here. I see it. Before you press it, confirm your wings level, and not fighting the trim. She checked the artificial horizon. Steady. Level, for now, by the grace of whatever margin she'd bought, with the last 90 seconds of hand flying. She pressed CMDA. A green light clicked on. The heavy resistance in the yoke vanished instantly, replaced by a rigid mechanical stillness, as the servos took hold, and the aircraft settled into a groove that felt, after the last 2 minutes, almost obscenely calm. Quinn dropped her hands from the yoke, and realized, only then, that her forearms were shaking. Autopilots engaged, she said. Good work, Navy. A pause, brief and warm, the kind of pause that told her the man on the other end had done this before, had talked strangers through worse. Now. How's your first officer? She looked over at Kessler. His color had gone from gray to something closer to ash, his breathing shallow and rapid, sweat beading along his hairline despite the cold recycled cabin air. He's going into shock, she said, keeping her voice low, level, the way you talk about a wounded man in front of him, without letting him hear how bad it sounds out loud. He needs trauma medics the second we're on the ground. I'm single pilot up here, Captain. Understood. We're vectoring you to Seattle-Tacoma, runway 16 left. 12,000 feet of dry concrete waiting for you. We're bringing you down to 10,000 now. Copy. What's the weather? A pause. Longer this time. 800-foot ceiling. 2 miles visibility. Light rain. Because of course it was. Of course the sky had decided that landing this thing safely wasn't enough of a story, she'd have to do it blind, too, trusting instruments through cloud, until the very last seconds, in an airframe she'd known for exactly 9 minutes. Quinn exhaled slowly through her nose. Copy that, she said. Talk me through it, Captain. All the way down. That's exactly what I'm here for, Commander. Behind her, through the cockpit door, she could hear Declan's voice rising and falling on the cabin PA, telling 200 strangers the truth, that both pilots were down, that a military pilot had control, that they were 20 minutes from Seattle. She couldn't make out the words clearly, through the door, but she didn't need to. She knew the shape of that speech. She'd have given a version of it herself, once, to junior pilots on the worst nights of their careers. Hold together. Trust the process. We're going to get through this. Kessler's head lolled sideways. His eyes were closed now, breath coming in short, uneven pulls. Stay with me, Quinn said again, quieter this time, not sure if she was talking to him, or to herself. Just a little longer. Ahead of the nose, the sky was still clear, a last, false calm before the cloud deck, that was waiting somewhere below 10,000 feet to swallow the aircraft whole. Somewhere behind her, 3 rows back, from a seat that used to have her name on it, an old man she hadn't known was on this flight sat gripping his armrests, praying in the particular, wordless way that career aviators pray, not to any god in particular, but to gravity, and physics, and whatever version of luck still owed him a favor, after all these years. And somewhere below all of them, on the ground in Seattle, a hearing room sat empty, and dark, waiting 6 more days to decide what Quinn Ashford's career was worth, with absolutely no idea that the woman it was about to judge was, at that exact moment, the only thing standing between 200 strangers, and the black water 3 miles below. The nose of the aircraft dipped, gently, obediently, toward the waiting clouds. Quinn Ashford leaned forward in the captain's seat, hands hovering just off the yoke, and began, for the second time in 6 weeks, the process of deciding whether she trusted herself enough to bring someone home alive. 10,000 feet. The cloud deck came up to meet them like something alive. Gray. Thick. Swallowing the windscreen whole in one long gray breath, until there was nothing left outside the glass, but static and rain, and the dim phantom glow of the wingtip lights reflecting back at her, useless. Quinn's hands hovered an inch off the yoke. Not touching. Not yet. The autopilot held the aircraft in a shallow, obedient descent, and she watched the altimeter unwind the way she used to watch fuel gauges on long combat air patrols, carefully. Reverently. Because numbers like that didn't lie, and numbers like that didn't care how tired you were. Heavy 442, Seattle approach. Turn left, heading 190. Descend and maintain 4000. Quinn keyed the mic, left to 190. Down to 4000. Heavy 442. Beside her, Kessler's breathing had changed. Shallower. Faster. Not good. She glanced over, without turning her head far, the old habit of a fighter pilot scan, eyes moving, head steady, always watching everything at once. His lips had gone the color of old bruises. Because that's not shock anymore. That's something worse. That's a body starting to shut things down it doesn't think it needs. Kessler. She kept her voice flat. Steady. The voice you use, when you need someone to answer you, and you can't afford to sound scared, while you ask. Talk to me. Nothing. Grant. His first name, pulled from some instinct she didn't examine too closely. Stay with me. His eyes fluttered. Found hers. Didn't quite focus. Cold, he mumbled. Because of course he's cold. Shock does that. Steals the blood, from the skin, and hoards it for the organs, that matter, and leaves a man shivering in 72-degree cabin air like he's standing in a snowbank. She reached over, without taking her eyes off the instruments, found a thin airline blanket wedged behind the jump seat, and threw it across his lap one-handed. Small talk later, she said. Stay awake for me now. Copy, he breathed. Barely a word. More like the ghost of one. The radio crackled. Heavy 442, Captain Whitfield again. How's my first officer doing, Commander? Deteriorating, Quinn said. No softening it. No time for softening it. I need medics standing by the second we stop rolling. Not walking over. Running. Copy that. I'll relay to Seattle Tacoma Fire and Rescue now. A pause. Then, quieter, like he was choosing the words carefully, how are you holding up, Navy? Because that question landed somewhere it shouldn't have. Somewhere underneath the checklist, underneath the training, underneath 10 years of learning not to answer that question honestly to anyone, ever, especially not to herself. I'm flying the airplane, Captain, she said. That's the only answer that matters right now. Copy that. The cloud thickened outside the windscreen. Rain streaked sideways across the glass in long silver lines, backlit by nothing, visible only because the wingtip strobe caught them for half a second at a time. 9,000 feet. 8. The aircraft shuddered once, light chop, nothing like the drop that had started all this, and Quinn's hand twitched toward the yoke, before she stopped herself. Trust the autopilot. Trust the machine. It doesn't get scared. It doesn't have a hearing in 6 days. It just flies the numbers you give it, exactly, every time, without a single feeling attached. She almost envied it. Somewhere behind the cockpit door, in the forward galley, Declan crouched beside Captain Holbrook's unconscious body, 2 fingers pressed to the man's throat, counting a pulse that felt thinner every time he checked it. Wren knelt across, from him, an oxygen mask fitted loosely, over Holbrook's face, her hands not quite steady on the strap. He's not waking up, she said. I know. Declan. He's not waking up. I know, Wren. His voice cracked on her name. He hadn't meant it to. 22 years flying this job, and he'd never once cracked in front of a passenger, and now here he was, cracking in front of a colleague half his age, because the man on the floor between them had a family, who had no idea, not yet, how close today had come to changing everything for them. Because that's the part of this job nobody prepares you for. Not the turbulence. Not the emergencies. The waiting. The counting of someone else's pulse, while a stranger you've never met flies the airplane you're both trapped inside. Behind them, the first-class cabin sat in a strange, suspended hush. No one spoke above a whisper. A woman 3 rows back was praying, with her rosary threaded, through white-knuckled fingers. A businessman across the aisle had put away his laptop for the first time, since boarding, and was simply staring at his own hands like he'd never really looked at them before. And near the curtain divider, still standing though no one had told him to, Elias Marsh watched the cockpit door like a man watching a hospital operating room, waiting for news that wouldn't come until it was already too late to do anything about. Because he had spent 11 years believing he knew everything there was to know about Quinn Ashford's ceiling. Her limits. What she could handle and what she couldn't. And here he was, watching her get tested by something no simulator, no training syllabus, no fitness report had ever prepared either of them for. He caught Declan's eye, through the gap in the curtain. "Purser," Marsh said, low, urgent. "I need to speak to the flight deck." Declan blinked at him. "Sir, I can't, passengers aren't permitted. I flew F-14 Tomcats off a carrier deck for 11 years, son. I made Rear Admiral before I was 50. And the woman flying this aircraft right now is someone I trained personally, which means I might be the only person on this airplane who can tell that captain on the radio exactly what she's capable of, if he needs to know it." Declan hesitated. Looked back at Holbrook's still, grey face. Looked at Wren, who gave the smallest possible nod. "I'll ask," Declan said. "That's all I can promise." 6,000 feet. The cloud deck showed no sign of breaking. Rain hammered the windscreen in a rhythm that felt, to Quinn, less like weather, and more like a countdown clock she couldn't see the numbers on. Because somewhere below this gray nothing is a runway. And somewhere between here and there is 100 small ways to die that she has never once trained for. Heavy 442, contact Seattle approach on 120.9er. She dialed the new frequency. Keyed the mic, Seattle approach, Heavy 442, level 4000. Heavy 442, radar contact. Fly heading 220, vectors for the ILS-16 left approach. Quinn adjusted the heading bug. The autopilot obeyed, banking the massive aircraft in a slow, patient turn that felt, from the captain's seat, like watching a whale change direction underwater. Because that's what this thing is. A whale. A beautiful, terrifying whale, and she is somehow supposed to land it on a strip of wet concrete she has never seen, with her own eyes. A soft tone chimed from the center console. Amber light, blinking, next to a gauge she didn't recognize. Her stomach dropped. "Whitfield," she said, keying the mic fast, the calm in her voice costing her more than it had all flight. "I've got an amber caution light. Fuel imbalance, left tank." A pause on the other end. Longer than she liked. "Copy, Commander. Can you read me the numbers on the fuel quantity gauge, left tank versus right?" She scanned the panel. Found the gauge. "Read it. Read it again, because the first read didn't seem possible. Left tank's reading 400 pounds lower than right. And it's still dropping." "Copy that." Whitfield's voice had lost some of its easy warmth. Not panic. Just precision, sharpening, the way a surgeon's voice sharpens, when the incision doesn't go the way the textbook said it would. "That's consistent with a fuel leak, Commander. Possible structural damage to the left wing tank during your turbulence encounter. Because the wing that dipped hardest. The wing that took the worst of the drop, the worst of Kessler's panicked overcorrection. Of course it was that wing. Of course the universe wasn't finished yet. How bad? Quinn said. Flat. No room for anything but the answer. I need you to give me your best estimate of the rate of loss. Watch it for 90 seconds, and read it back to me. 90 seconds. She counted them in her head, eyes locked on the gauge, watching the needle creep downward in small, relentless increments. Because 90 seconds is nothing. 90 seconds is the length of a commercial break. And right now it feels like the longest 90 seconds of her entire life, longer than any final approach, onto a pitching carrier deck at night, because this time there's no landing signal officer talking her down, no backup plan, if she gets it wrong, just her, and a gauge, and 200 people, who don't know, yet that the ground beneath their feet just got a lot more urgent. 90 seconds, she said finally. Lost 60 pounds. A pause. She could hear, faintly, the sound of someone else's voice in the background on Whitfield's end, another engineer, maybe, running numbers she couldn't hear. Okay, Commander. Here's what that means. At that rate, you've got fuel margin for the approach, and landing, with some buffer. Not much. But it's there. What it means operationally is this: no go-arounds. No missed approach. You get one shot at this runway, and you make it work the first time. Quinn's jaw tightened. Copy, she said. One shot. One shot, Whitfield confirmed. I know that's not what you wanted to hear. Captain, Quinn said. Nothing today is what I wanted to hear. Because 6 weeks ago, she'd said something similar. Almost exactly similar. Standing on a flight deck at 2 a.m, headset pressed hard against her ear, watching a wall of weather roll in off the horizon like something out of a nightmare she hadn't had yet. Sir, I'm recommending we wave off the launch. Say again, Ashford. Winds shifted 11 degrees off the bow in the last 4 minutes. Decks pitching worse than forecast. I do not recommend launching aircraft into this. Silence on the radio. The particular, heavy silence of a commander weighing a junior officer's judgment against a mission clock that didn't care about weather. Copy your recommendation, Ashford. Noted. We're launching on schedule. Sir. Noted, Lieutenant Commander. Clear the deck. She had stood there, helmet on, visor down, close enough to the catapult to feel its heat, through her boots, and watched Roy Sutter's jet get shot off the deck, into black water, and worse weather, because a man 3 ranks above her had decided a schedule mattered more than a gut feeling he didn't have the flight hours to understand. Roy's voice, 40 seconds later, cutting through the radio, tight and controlled the way pilots get right, before things stop being controlled at all. 471, I've got instrument disagreement. Attitude indicators. Static. 471, say again. More static. And then nothing. Nothing at all, for 3 seconds, that felt, even now, 6 weeks later, 34,000 feet above the Cascades, like the longest 3 seconds of her entire life, until the search and rescue helicopters lifted off, and the ocean gave nothing back. Because Quinn had told them. She had told them the exact thing that killed him, an unreliable attitude reference, a system she'd flagged twice in the previous week's maintenance logs, a fault that should have grounded that airframe until it was fixed properly instead of patched, and cleared for one more sortie. And nobody had listened. Not until it was too late to matter to anyone except a board of inquiry looking for someone convenient to blame. Which was her. Because the man, who gave the launch order outranked everyone in that hearing room, and dead pilots don't get court-martialed, and living, insubordinate ones who'd been right, made for a much cleaner story. The cockpit door clicked. Quinn's head snapped toward it, one hand instinctively tightening on the yoke even, though the autopilot was still flying. Declan's face appeared in the gap. Commander, I'm sorry to interrupt. There's a passenger. He says he's a retired admiral. He says he trained you. Quinn's chest went tight in a way that had nothing to do with fuel gauges or weather. "What's his name?" she said, though some part of her already knew the answer, before Declan finished the sentence. "Marsh. Elias Marsh. Because of all the people on all the flights in the world, of course. Of course it was him. Of course the man flying to Seattle to help decide her fate was 3 rows behind her the entire time, and neither of them had known it, until the sky fell apart around them both. "Let him in," Quinn said. "But he doesn't touch anything. He talks to Kessler. Keeps him conscious. That's it." "Copy." The door opened wider. Elias Marsh stepped through, and for one suspended half-second, the two of them just looked at each other, 11 years of history compressed, into a glance, a training squadron, a nugget aviator, with something to prove, a mentor who'd bet his own reputation on her once, and was now, 6 weeks later, sitting on the board that might end everything he'd helped build. "Commander," Marsh said. Formal. Careful. Like he wasn't sure which version of their relationship applied at 34,000 feet. "Admiral," Quinn answered, just as careful. "I could use another set of hands, that aren't mine on the radio traffic. You up for it? Try and stop me." Because that answer, more than anything he could have said about the hearing, about the 6 weeks of silence between them, told her everything she needed to know. He hadn't come here to judge her. Whatever he'd been asked to do in that hearing room, whatever the letter in his pocket said, right now, in this moment, he was just a pilot, helping another pilot. He crouched beside Kessler's seat, checking the young man's pulse, with 2 fingers against his throat the same way Declan had checked the captain's. "Stay with us, son," Marsh said, low, steady, the voice of a man who'd talked frightened aviators through worse. "You did everything right up until the point you couldn't anymore. Nobody's going to hold that against you." Kessler's eyes fluttered open, found the older man's face, found something there that seemed to anchor him for a moment. "Who?" he managed. "Somebody who's flown longer than you've been alive," Marsh said. "Focus on my voice. Not the noise. Just my voice. 3,000 feet. Still nothing but gray outside the windscreen. Rain streaking. The wingtip strobe flashing white against cloud that refused to end. Heavy 442, descend and maintain 2000, cleared ILS approach runway 16 left." Quinn dialed the numbers. Watched the aircraft respond, nose easing down another degree, the whole airframe settling into the glide path like something enormous finally agreeing to be led somewhere. "Fuel check," Whitfield said over the radio. Quinn read the gauge. Her stomach tightened. "Left tank's down another 80 pounds, since last check. Rates increasing." A pause. Longer this time. She could hear, faintly, muffled conversation on his end, voices layered over each other, urgency dressed up as procedure. "Copy that, Commander," Whitfield said finally. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Your margin just got thinner. You still have enough for one approach, provided nothing goes wrong on the way down. But I need you to understand, there is no second attempt in this scenario. You get it right the first time, or we're having a very different conversation." Because that sentence, that exact sentence, was the one that finally, truly frightened her. Not the turbulence. Not the blood on her forearm. Not even the fuel gauge itself. It was the phrase "a very different conversation," delivered in a voice trained specifically never to sound afraid, and failing, just slightly, at the very end. Quinn closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "Open them." "Copy," she said. "One shot." "Understood." Beside her, Marsh had gone very still, listening to every word, his weathered face unreadable in the strobing amber light of the caution panel. "Commander," he said quietly, once the radio traffic paused. "Whatever's happening with that fuel gauge, you focus on flying this airplane. I'll handle relaying anything that needs relaying. You don't carry 2 jobs today. Just the one. Because that was the thing about Elias Marsh she had forgotten. Somewhere in 6 weeks of grief, and guilt and rehearsed testimony, he had always known exactly which weight to lift off her shoulders, and exactly when to do it. Copy that, she said, and something in her chest loosened, just slightly, just enough to breathe. 2,000 feet. The cloud began, finally, to thin. Not break, not yet, but thin, texture returning to the gray, shapes suggesting themselves at the edges of visibility like memories trying to surface. Gear check in 3 minutes, Whitfield said. Flaps 30. I'll walk you through each step. Nothing happens on this airplane today that we don't do together. Copy. Kessler stirred beside her, eyes opening, finding Marsh's face first, then hers. Commander, he rasped. Right here. Fuel, he said. I heard the leak. I've got it, Quinn said. Firm. Final. The tone she used, with junior pilots, who needed to hear that someone else was carrying the weight now, even if it wasn't entirely true. You focus on staying with us. That's the only job you've got left today. His eyes closed again, but his breathing steadied, just slightly, like the sound of her voice alone had bought him another few minutes. Because that's the strange mathematics of command, sometimes the bravest thing you can do for someone else isn't fixing the problem. It's simply refusing to let your voice shake, while you tell them it's being handled. Marsh watched her work, watched the small, economical movements of her hands on the panel, the way her eyes cut between the instruments, and the radio, and Kessler's failing color, cataloging threats in an order only she seemed to fully understand, and felt something crack open in his chest, that had been sealed shut for 6 weeks. Because he had spent all that time telling himself he didn't know the full story. That the board would sort out fact from fear, truth from convenient blame. That his job was simply to answer questions honestly, and let the process work the way it was designed to. But watching her now, watching the exact same instincts that had gotten her recommended for fighters 11 years ago, the same steel, the same refusal to let fear translate into hesitation, he understood, with a clarity that felt almost violent, that the board wasn't going to see any of this. They would see a hearing room. A transcript. A dead pilot's name on a casualty report. They would never see this. Which meant it was on him to make sure they did. Commander, he said, quiet, beneath the radio chatter. When this is over. When we're on the ground. I need to tell you something about the hearing. Quinn didn't take her eyes off the instruments. Not now, sir. I know. Not now. But soon. Because I don't think you understand what I've spent 6 weeks trying to decide, and I think it's about time I finally told someone the truth about what I saw in Roy Sutter's maintenance logs, before any of this happened. Her hands went very still on the yoke for exactly 1 second. Because that sentence, maintenance logs, landed like a hand closing around her throat. She had flagged the fault. Twice. In writing. And somehow, in 6 weeks of silence, in 6 weeks of assuming no one had listened, no one had cared, no one had looked, it had never once occurred to her that someone had been looking. That someone, somewhere, had seen exactly what she'd seen, and said nothing, until now. Sir, she said, voice tight. You have 30 seconds to tell me, if that's something I need to know, before I land this airplane, or if it can wait, until we're both alive to talk about it properly. Marsh exhaled. Long, heavy. The exhale of a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying much too long alone. It can wait, he said. But Quinn, it's the truth. And it's going to change everything. She didn't answer. Couldn't, not with 1,200 feet of gray cloud still between her, and a runway she'd never seen, not with a fuel gauge ticking down toward a number that had only one acceptable outcome attached to it. But something in her chest had shifted anyway. Some old, Cold weight had cracked, just slightly, just enough to let a single thread of light through, the first hint, in 6 long weeks, that maybe, the story the Navy was about to tell about Roy Sutter's death wasn't going to be the only story left standing, when this was over. Heavy 442, you're 800 feet, 3 miles from the marker. Gear down, flaps 30. Quinn's hand moved to the gear handle. Pulled. Felt the deep mechanical shudder run through the airframe, as the wheels descended into the slipstream, the roar of drag filling the floorboards beneath her boots. 3 green lights lit the panel. Gear down and locked, she said. Copy that, Commander. Whitfield's voice, steady, present, carrying her the way a good wingman carries a struggling flight lead. You're doing exactly what you need to be doing. Cloud base should break around 800 feet. When it does, you'll see the runway lights. When you see them, you tell me, and we'll bring you home. Because home was a strange word to use for a runway she'd never touched, in a city she was flying toward specifically, because a board of officers wanted to take her wings away. But right now, 800 feet above a fuel leak, and a broken first officer, and an old man carrying 6 weeks of silence he'd finally decided to break, home was simply this, a strip of wet concrete, waiting somewhere in the gray, and the chance to walk away, from this cockpit, with everyone alive. The altimeter unwound. 1,000 feet. 900. The cloud shredded apart. And there, dead ahead, flanked by a violent constellation of strobing white and red, lay runway 16 left, wet, gleaming, real, closer than Quinn had let herself believe it would ever actually be. Runway in sight, she said, and her voice, for the first time in 20 minutes, was not entirely steady. Heavy 442 has the runway. Copy that, Navy, Whitfield said, and she could hear, unmistakably now, the relief breaking through his professional calm. She's all yours from here. Bring her home. Quinn's hand found the yoke. Tightened. Beside her, Kessler's eyes opened one more time, found hers, and held. Behind her, Elias Marsh sat forward in the jump seat, hands braced against the console, watching the woman he'd trained 11 years ago fly toward a runway neither of them had ever seen together, carrying, between the two of them, a secret about to change everything the Navy thought it knew about the last night of Roy Sutter's life. 400 feet. The threshold rushed up to meet them, through sheets of rain, and Quinn Ashford leaned into the yoke, and the last mile of sky between her and the ground began, at last, to close. 200 feet. The rain came sideways now, hammering the windscreen in sheets that the wipers could barely keep pace with, thump thump thump, a metronome counting down the last seconds of the longest 20 minutes of Quinn Ashford's life. Because this was the part nobody warned her about. Not the flying. The seeing. 200 feet, and the runway was right there, close enough to touch, except it wasn't, except 200 tons of aircraft still had to be talked down the last 150 feet, without breaking anything, including the woman flying it. Heavy 442, you're on the glide slope. On centerline. Whitfield's voice, steady as a heartbeat. Listen to me, Commander. You're Navy. You're trained to fly a glide path straight into the deck. A controlled crash. Do that here, and you'll shear the main gear struts. You'll rip the engines off the wings. You have to flare. Copy, Quinn said. Her jaw ached from clenching it. Arrest your descent rate right before touchdown. Not before. Not after. Right before. 100 feet. Because in a Hornet, you don't flare. You fly it, onto the deck, and let the tailhook do the rest of the arguing. 10 years of that instinct screaming in her hands right now, telling her to keep the nose down, keep the glide path, trust the wire, that isn't there. 50 feet. The runway lights blurred past on either side, streaking gold through the rain. Kessler's hand found the edge of his seat, and gripped it, knuckles white even, through the pain fogging his eyes. Behind her, Marsh braced against the jump seat, silent, watching, praying in the wordless way career aviators pray. 40. 30. Flare, Navy. Flare now. Quinn hauled the yoke back. Every ounce of 10 years of muscle memory screaming against the motion, and she did it anyway, pulling the nose up, pulling the throttles to idle in the same breath, and the massive aircraft floated, actually floated, suspended for one long, impossible second above the wet concrete like it wasn't sure it wanted to commit to the ground at all. Because that second lasted longer than the whole flight. That second was, where Roy Sutter lived, and the hearing room lived, and every version of the last 6 weeks lived, all compressed into one held breath above a runway in the rain. The main gear found concrete. A hard, teeth-rattling crack. The whole airframe shuddered, bounced, a second sickening wallow, and then settled, struts compressing, and Quinn was already shoving the yoke forward, driving the nose gear down, hand moving to the spoiler lever, before her brain had finished catching up with her body. Speed breaks up. She said it out loud, to herself, the way she used to talk herself, through a hot recovery on a pitching deck. The panels on the wings snapped skyward, killing lift. She grabbed the reverse thrust levers, and hauled them back. The engines howled, redirecting thousands of pounds of thrust forward, and the deceleration hit like a wall, Quinn thrown against her harness, boots planted hard on the brakes, the anti-lock system pulsing beneath her feet in a rapid, mechanical heartbeat. 100 knots. 80. 60. At 30, she eased the reverse thrust back to idle. The roar died. What was left was rain, and tires humming, over centerline lights, and the ragged sound of her own breathing filling a cockpit, that had, somehow, against every reasonable expectation, stopped trying to kill everyone inside it. She steered the aircraft off the high-speed exit. Brought it to a full, shuddering stop on the taxiway. Pulled the parking brake. Silence. Because silence, after that, sounded like the loudest thing she had ever heard in her life. Heavy 442. The tower controller's voice, softer now, human in a way radio voices rarely allowed themselves to be. Fire and rescue approaching your aircraft. Welcome to Seattle, Commander. Quinn's hands were locked around the yoke, fingers curled into claws she couldn't quite make let go. She stared through the rain-streaked windscreen at flashing red and blue lights converging from every direction, and felt, for the first time in 20 minutes, the full weight of everything she'd been holding back land on her chest all at once. She didn't cry. Wouldn't let herself. Not yet. Beside her, Marsh reached forward, and rested one hand, briefly, on her shoulder. Said nothing. Didn't need to. The cockpit door burst open. Declan stood there, tears streaking his ashen face, and behind him the muffled roar of 200 passengers cheering, crying, clapping, the sound of a nightmare ending in the only way anyone had dared to hope it would. Open the door, Quinn said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to, but steady. Steady enough. Get the medics to Kessler first. They came fast, neon jackets, gurneys, a controlled chaos of practiced efficiency Quinn recognized, from a dozen training exercises she'd never expected to see, from this angle. Kessler was out of his seat, and onto a backboard, within 90 seconds, his eyes finding Quinn's one last time, before the medics wheeled him back, through the cabin. Thank you, he mouthed. No sound behind it. He didn't need sound. Holbrook was already gone, from the galley, loaded onto a second gurney, an oxygen mask fogging, with each shallow breath, alive, still alive, which was more than anyone had dared to promise an hour ago. A paramedic, older, gray-haired, radio strapped across her chest, paused at the cockpit door, and looked at Quinn the way you look at something you can't quite categorize. Faded jeans. Blood dried brown across her forearm. No uniform. No wings pinned to her chest, nothing to explain what she'd just done except the fact that she'd done it. You flew this thing down, the medic asked. Quinn looked past her, out through the open cabin door, at the wet tarmac, and the flashing lights, and 200 strangers, who would never fully understand what the last 20 minutes had cost her. "Somebody had to," she said. They kept her at the gate for almost an hour. Investigators, airline officials, a Seattle police officer taking notes on a form that didn't seem built for a story like this one. Quinn answered every question in the flat, economical language of a formal debrief, because that was the only language she trusted herself to use right now. Anything softer, anything closer to the truth of how she actually felt, might not stop once it started. Elias Marsh stayed the entire time. Didn't interrupt. Didn't hover. Just stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching over her the way he used to watch new pilots complete their first solo carrier landing, close enough to help, if something went wrong, far enough to let her prove she didn't need it. When the last investigator finally closed his notebook, and walked away, Marsh stepped up beside her. "You did that," he said. "All of it. However this week goes, from here, nobody can ever take that away from you." Because that sentence should have felt like comfort. And it did, for exactly as long as it took Quinn to remember what this week actually meant. "The hearing's still in 5 days," she said. "I know. You're still on the board. I know that too." He paused. Chose his next words, with the deliberate care of a man who had spent 30 years learning that words, once launched, could not be recalled like an aircraft on approach. "Which is why I need to tell you something I should have told you 6 weeks ago. And I need you to hear all of it, before you decide how angry you're allowed to be at me." Quinn's stomach tightened. She'd been braced for this, since somewhere over the Cascades, since the moment he'd said the words maintenance logs, through a headset, while she was fighting to keep a leaking aircraft in the air. She just hadn't let herself think about it, until now, when there was finally nothing else demanding her attention. "Say it," she said. Marsh exhaled. Long, slow. The exhale of a man setting down something he'd been carrying much too far, much too long, alone. 2 days after Sutter's aircraft went down, I requested the maintenance records for 471. Not officially. Not through channels that would leave a paper trail anyone could trace back to me asking. Quietly. Because something about the initial incident report didn't sit right with me, and 30 years of flying taught me to trust that feeling. And I found your flags, Quinn. Both of them. Filed exactly when you said you filed them. Documented exactly as thoroughly as you would have documented them, because I trained you to document everything twice, as carefully as anyone would ever ask you to. His jaw tightened. The attitude reference fault you reported 8 days before the launch. The follow-up report you filed 48 hours before Sutter's aircraft went down, recommending the airframe be grounded until the fault was fully diagnosed. Because there it was. 6 weeks of silence, 6 weeks of believing no one had listened, no one had looked, no one had cared enough to check, and the entire time, the man standing across from her had known. Had known, and said nothing, while she carried the weight of Roy Sutter's death through every waking hour since. 6 weeks, Quinn said, very quietly. You've known for 6 weeks. I have. And you said nothing. I said nothing, Marsh agreed, because I was afraid of exactly what saying something would cost. Not you. Me. My name attached to evidence that makes Commander Holloway look like a man who overrode a documented safety concern and got a pilot killed doing it. That's not a small accusation, Quinn. That's a career-ending one. Possibly worse. And I told myself I needed more time to be certain, before I set something like that in motion. That's not an excuse. No, Marsh said. It isn't. It's just the truth. And I decided, somewhere over the Cascades tonight, watching you land an airplane you'd never flown, with a hole in the wing, and a dying man beside you, I decided I'd run out of time to wait for the version of this, where I feel certain enough to be brave. I'm telling the board everything I found. All of it. Whether it costs me my seat or not. Quinn stared at him for a long moment. Anger and relief tangled so tightly together in her chest that she couldn't separate one from the other, couldn't decide which one she was allowed to feel first, or whether she was allowed to feel both at once. "Why now?" she said finally. "Why tonight?" Marsh looked past her, out toward the aircraft still sitting on the taxiway, rain sheeting down its fuselage under floodlights. "Because I watched you make the exact same call tonight that you made 6 weeks ago on that flight deck," he said. "Trust your training. Trust what the instruments are telling you, even when it's inconvenient. Even when someone, with more rank than you wants a different answer." He looked back at her. "You were right both times, Quinn. It just took me 6 weeks, and a leaking fuel tank to find the courage to say, so where it counts." They gave her a hotel room near the airport, that night, courtesy of an airline that clearly understood the value of getting a story like this one settled quietly and comfortably before the press found the shape of it. Quinn didn't sleep. Sat on the edge of the bed in borrowed sweatpants, staring at a phone she hadn't turned back on since boarding, and thought about an 18-year-old at the Naval Academy, who was, by now, almost certainly aware that a commercial flight had made national news. Because that's the thing about news cycles. They don't ask permission. They just arrive, uninvited, in the middle of someone's ordinary Tuesday, and rearrange everything the person thought they knew. She thought about calling him. Didn't know what she'd say, and didn't trust herself not to say too much, before the hearing, before the truth had a proper place to land instead of just spilling out sideways, over a phone call at midnight. Instead she opened her jacket, still hanging over the back of the hotel chair, and pulled out the letter she'd been carrying for 6 weeks. "Lieutenant Commander Ashford is directed to appear before the Board of Inquiry. 5 days." She read it once more, and this time, for the first time in 6 weeks, the words didn't feel like a verdict already written. They felt like something closer to an opening, a door that hadn't fully closed yet, no matter how much it had felt like one. The 5 days passed the way waiting always does, too slowly to bear, and too quickly to prepare for, both at once. Quinn spent most of it in a temporary billet at Naval Air Station Whidbey Island, running the same testimony, over and over in her head, editing it down to the bones, the way she'd once edited a mission brief, until every word carried its full weight, and nothing more. On the 3rd day, a knock came at her door. She opened it expecting a duty officer. Found, instead, a boy standing there in an academy candidate's uniform, jaw set in a way that made her chest tighten, before he'd said a single word. "Commander Ashford?" His voice cracked slightly on her name. "That's me. I'm Cole Sutter." He swallowed. "Roy Sutter was my father." Because there it was. The moment she had rehearsed 100 different ways in her head, over 6 weeks, and none of the rehearsals had prepared her for how young he looked standing in a dormitory hallway, trying so hard to hold himself like a man twice his age. "I know who you are," Quinn said quietly. "Come in." He stood just inside the doorway, hands clasped behind his back in a posture she recognized instantly, parade rest, the stance drilled into every plebe at the academy, until it became instinct even in a moment that called for anything but formality. "I saw the news," he said. "About the flight. About what you did. Cole. I need to ask you something," he said, and his voice wavered, just slightly, the careful military bearing cracking at the edges. "And I need you to tell me the truth. Not the version people think I want to hear. The truth." Quinn nodded once. "Ask. Did my father die, because of something you did wrong?" Because that question had been waiting for her, since the moment she'd learned his name existed. Since the photograph on the corkboard. Since every version of this conversation she'd built, and discarded in her head, alone, at 3 a.m, over 6 impossible weeks. She sat down on the edge of the bed, so she wasn't looking down at him, and gestured for him to sit in the chair across from her. He did, stiffly, hands still clasped, eyes fixed on hers like she was the only solid thing in a room that had otherwise stopped making sense. "No," Quinn said. Flat. Certain. The truth, finally, spoken out loud to the one person in the world who most deserved to hear it first. "Your father did not die because of anything I did wrong. He died because I told my commanding officer that the aircraft your father flew that night had a documented, unresolved instrument fault. I recommended we ground it. I recommended the whole launch be delayed until weather cleared. I was overruled." Cole's jaw tightened. "By who?" "That's what the hearing in 2 days is going to determine." "Officially." Quinn held his gaze. "Unofficially, I can tell you this. Your father was one of the best pilots I ever flew with. He followed every order he was given exactly the way he was trained to. He did nothing wrong. Nothing. The system around him failed him, Cole. Not the other way around." The boy's composure held for exactly 3 more seconds. Then it broke, not loudly, not dramatically, just a single sharp exhale, and eyes that filled too fast to blink back, the specific grief of someone who has spent 6 weeks needing an answer, and finally getting one that hurts in an entirely different way than the not knowing had hurt. "Everyone kept telling me it was pilot error," he said, voice cracking fully now. "That's what the initial report said. Pilot error, contributing factors under review. I've spent 6 weeks trying to figure out what my dad did wrong. What I would have done differently, if it had been me in that cockpit." "Nothing," Quinn said, and reached forward, and put a hand on his shoulder the way Marsh had put a hand on hers in the rain 2 nights ago. "You would have done nothing differently, because there was nothing to do differently." He trusted the chain of command the way he was trained to trust it. That trust is what killed him. Not his flying. Cole nodded, slowly, wiping at his eyes, with the back of one hand, embarrassed and grieving, and grateful all at once, in the particular tangle of emotions that only exists in people young enough to still believe those feelings are supposed to arrive one at a time. "Will you say that?" he asked. "At the hearing? Will you say exactly what you just told me?" "Word for word," Quinn said. "I promise you that." The hearing room at Naval Air Station Whidbey Island was smaller than Quinn had imagined it in 6 weeks of rehearsal. A long table. 9 officers in dress uniform, seated in a row, that felt, from where she stood at attention, less like judgment, and more like a wall she was expected to somehow walk through. Commander Holloway sat 2 seats, from the center, jaw set, eyes fixed somewhere, over Quinn's shoulder, refusing to meet hers directly. Because that's what men like Holloway do, she thought. They avoid the eyes of the people they've wronged. It's easier that way. Easier to override a wave-off recommendation, from a subordinate, when you never have to look her in the face afterward, and explain why. The proceedings opened, with the formal reading of the incident report, sterile, clinical language describing the loss of Lieutenant Roy Sutter, and Aircraft 471, contributing factors still listed, as under review. Quinn stood through it, with her hands clasped behind her back, jaw tight, saying nothing, because nothing had been asked of her yet. Then the presiding officer, a rear admiral named Castellano, with a voice like gravel, and eyes that missed nothing, turned to the gallery. The board will now hear testimony, from character and technical witnesses. Rear Admiral Elias Marsh, retired, you may proceed. Marsh rose from his seat in the second row, straightened his jacket, and walked to the small witness table set, before the board, with the unhurried gait of a man, who had made peace, somewhere over the last 5 days, with exactly what this moment was going to cost him. Admiral Marsh, Castellano said. You were asked to appear, as a character witness for Lieutenant Commander Ashford. Please proceed with your testimony. With respect, Admiral, Marsh said, I'm going to need to expand the scope of what I testify to today. Because character isn't the only thing this board needs to hear about. A stir moved, through the room, subtle, the particular ripple of officers, who sense a hearing about to depart, from its script. "Explain," Castellano said. Marsh reached into his jacket, and produced a folder, thin, unremarkable, the kind of folder that could contain anything, from a lunch order to the end of someone's career. "4 days ago, I obtained copies of the maintenance logs for aircraft 471, covering the 10 days prior to its loss." He set the folder on the table, didn't open it yet. "I obtained them, because something about this hearing's premise troubled me, and 30 years in naval aviation taught me never to trust a conclusion I hadn't personally verified." "Admiral Marsh," Holloway interjected, voice sharp. "This is a character hearing. Maintenance records fall outside." "They fall entirely within scope, Commander," Castellano said, without looking at him, "if they bear on the cause of the incident under review." "Continue, Admiral Marsh." Marsh opened the folder. "On these pages," he said, "are 2 documented safety flags filed by Lieutenant Commander Quinn Ashford. The first, 8 days prior to the incident, reporting an unreliable attitude reference on aircraft 471 during a routine post-flight inspection. The second, filed 48 hours before the incident, explicitly recommending the aircraft be grounded pending further diagnosis of that same fault." He let the words sit in the room for exactly as long as it took every officer at that table to understand their weight. On the night of the incident, Marsh continued, Lieutenant Commander Ashford verbally recommended a wave-off of the entire launch sequence, citing worsening weather, and specifically referencing the unresolved instrument fault on 471. That recommendation was overruled by the officer in command of flight operations that night. Every eye in the room turned, in slow, inevitable unison, toward Commander Holloway. Because that's the moment, Quinn thought, standing rigid at attention, watching 6 weeks of carried blame finally begin to shift its weight onto the shoulders it had always belonged to. That's the exact moment the story everyone had been telling themselves started, quietly, irreversibly, to come apart. "Admiral Marsh," Holloway said, voice tight, "with respect, operational tempo requires commanders to weigh multiple factors beyond a single junior officer's." "Commander," Castellano said, and the single word landed like a hand slammed flat on the table. "You will have the opportunity to respond formally. This board did not convene to hear you interrupt sworn testimony." He turned back to Marsh. "Continue, Admiral." "There's little more to add," Marsh said. "The documentation speaks for itself." Lieutenant Commander Ashford identified a legitimate safety concern, through proper channels, not once but twice. She raised it again, verbally, at the moment it mattered most. She was overruled by a superior officer, who possessed the same information she did, and chose, for reasons this board is better positioned than I am to examine, to disregard it. He closed the folder. Lieutenant Roy Sutter did not die, because of pilot error. He died because a documented, preventable hazard was allowed to remain in service. I would ask this board to consider that distinction very carefully, before reaching any conclusion about Commander Ashford's fitness to continue flying for this Navy. Silence settled over the room, thick and total, the particular silence Quinn had heard only twice, before in her life, once on a flight deck, after a cable snapped, once high above the cascades in a cockpit filling, with the sound of an amber caution light she hadn't wanted to see. Castellano looked down the table at his fellow officers. Then back at Marsh. "Thank you, Admiral. You're excused." He turned toward Quinn. "Lieutenant Commander Ashford. The board will now hear your statement." Quinn stepped forward to the witness table. Stood at attention for a moment longer than strictly required, gathering the last of whatever composure 6 weeks of grief had left her. Because this was it. The moment she'd rehearsed 100 different versions of, alone, in a hotel room, on an airplane, in a cockpit filling, with smoke and static, and the sound of her own heartbeat. And now that it was actually here, none of the rehearsed versions felt like they belonged to her anymore. "Admiral Castellano," she said. "Board members. I'd like to begin by telling you about a young man I met 3 days ago. His name is Cole Sutter. He's a candidate at the Naval Academy. He's Roy Sutter's son." A flicker of something crossed several faces at the table, not surprise, exactly, but a recalibration, the particular shift of officers, who had walked into this room expecting one kind of hearing, and were now, slowly, being led toward another. "Cole asked me a question 3 days ago," Quinn continued. "He asked me if his father died because of something I did wrong. I told him no. I'm telling this board the same thing today, under oath, with the same certainty I gave him." She let her eyes move, deliberately, down the table, until they found Holloway's. He held her gaze this time. Didn't look away. "I flagged the attitude reference fault on aircraft 471 twice, through proper channels. I recommended, verbally, that the launch be delayed given worsening weather, and an unresolved safety concern on that specific airframe. I was overruled by a superior officer. Lieutenant Sutter followed his orders exactly, as he was trained to. He trusted the chain of command, with his life, the way every officer in this room was trained to trust it. That trust killed him." Her voice held steady, barely, the 6 weeks of carried weight finally finding somewhere to land besides her own chest. "I am not here today to ask this board to excuse insubordination. I raised my concerns, through every channel available to me, and when those concerns were overruled, I complied with a lawful order, exactly as I was required to. What I am asking this board to consider is whether an officer should be punished for having been right." Castellano studied her for a long moment. The room held its breath around him. "Lieutenant Commander," he said finally, "is there anything else you'd like to add to the record?" Quinn thought of Roy. Thought of a photograph pinned to a corkboard, half covered by a duty roster. Thought of a boy standing stiff, and grieving in a hotel doorway, needing one true thing in a week full of official language, that had given him nothing solid to hold on to. "Only this," she said. "Somewhere in a dormitory not far from here, there's an 18-year-old who's going to spend the rest of his life either believing his father made a fatal mistake, or knowing his father died doing exactly what he was trained to do, failed by a system that didn't listen when it mattered most. This board's decision doesn't just determine my career, Admiral. It determines which one of those stories that young man carries for the rest of his life. I would ask you to remember that when you deliberate." The board recessed for deliberation. Quinn waited in a small anteroom down the hall, Marsh seated beside her, neither of them speaking, the silence between them carrying a different weight now than it had 6 weeks ago, lighter, somehow, even under the circumstances. The silence of two people, who had finally stopped hiding things from each other. "However this goes," Marsh said eventually, "I want you to know something." "Sir. Let me finish." He turned to face her fully. 11 years ago, I pulled a Nugget aviator out of a training squadron, because she flew like she had nothing left to lose, and everything left to prove. I put my name behind her recommendation to fighters, because I believed, absolutely, that she was going to be one of the finest pilots this Navy ever produced. He paused. "I was right then. And watching you bring that aircraft down 5 nights ago, with a hole in the wing, and a dying man beside you, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Whatever this board decides today, that doesn't change." Quinn's throat tightened. She didn't trust herself to answer right away. "Thank you," she managed finally. "For that night. For the hearing. For finally saying it." "Don't thank me," Marsh said. "I waited 6 weeks longer than I should have. That's not something to thank a man for. That's something to hold him accountable for, and someday, when you're ready, I'd welcome you doing exactly that." The door opened. A yeoman stood in the frame. "Commander Ashford. The board is ready." They filed back into the hearing room. Quinn stood at attention, before the long table, spine straight, eyes forward, the way she'd stood at attention 100 times, before in 100 rooms, that had asked less of her than this one. Castellano cleared his throat. Lieutenant Commander Ashford. This board has reviewed the testimony presented, including the documentary evidence submitted by Admiral Marsh. It is the finding of this board, that the loss of Lieutenant Roy Sutter, and Aircraft 471 resulted, from a failure of command decision-making, specifically the disregard of a documented safety concern properly raised, through appropriate channels. Because those words, those exact words, disregard of a documented safety concern, landed in Quinn's chest like something finally, after 6 weeks, allowed to exhale. This board finds, that Lieutenant Commander Ashford acted at all times in accordance, with her training, her judgment, and her obligations, as a naval officer. No further disciplinary action will be pursued against her in connection with this incident. Castellano paused. Looked down the table, briefly, toward Holloway, whose face had gone the color of old ash. This board will, separately, refer the conduct of Commander Holloway to a formal investigation regarding the override of a properly documented safety recommendation. That matter will proceed under separate review. He looked back at Quinn. Lieutenant Commander Ashford, this board additionally wishes to formally note, for the record, your conduct aboard Heavy 4425 nights ago, in which you assumed emergency control of a commercial aircraft, with 2 flight crew incapacitated, and successfully executed an emergency landing under severe weather conditions, with a compromised fuel system, saving the lives of 211 passengers and crew. His voice, gravel-worn and unhurried, softened by the smallest fraction. This board recommends you for the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, for heroism not involving actual conflict with an enemy. That recommendation will be forwarded through appropriate channels. Quinn stood perfectly still. Somewhere behind her ribs, 6 weeks of carried weight finally, fully, set itself down. Do you have anything further to add to the record, Commander? Castellano asked. Quinn's eyes found a face at the back of the gallery, Cole Sutter, sitting stiff and formal in a folding chair he had no official reason to occupy, tears standing unashamed in his eyes, waiting on her answer the way he had waited on it in that hotel doorway 3 days earlier. No, Admiral, she said. The record speaks for itself now. That's all I ever wanted it to do. They found each other outside, on the covered walkway between buildings, rain falling soft and steady the way it always seemed to fall in this part of the world, patient and unhurried, and entirely indifferent to the size of what had just happened inside. Cole stood waiting for her, hands no longer clasped behind his back in parade rest, just hanging loose at his sides, a young man rather than a candidate for the first time, since she'd met him. I heard, he said. Someone in the hallway. They said Holloway's under investigation. He is. And you're, he struggled for the word. Cleared. You're cleared. I am. Quinn studied his face, the particular relief of someone who had spent 6 weeks carrying a story he'd been told to believe, only to have it finally, officially replaced by the truth. Your father didn't fail anyone, Cole. The record shows that now. Officially. Permanently. He nodded, wiped at his eyes, and for a moment neither of them said anything, just stood together under the gray Pacific Northwest sky, 2 people bound by a loss neither of them had chosen, and a truth they'd both finally been allowed to claim. What happens now? Cole asked. For you, I mean. Quinn thought about it. Thought about the empty months ahead, no more hearings, no more rehearsed testimony, just the long slow work of learning how to carry grief, that finally had somewhere honest to rest. I go back to flying, she said. That's what I do. What happens for you? I've got 3 more years at the academy. He straightened, some of the old formality returning, though softer now, chosen rather than defensive. After that, flight school. I want to fly fighters. Same as my dad wanted, before, he stopped. Started again. Same as my dad. Quinn felt something settle in her chest, warm and unexpected, the shape of a door opening somewhere she hadn't thought to look for one. When you get to flight school, she said, and you call me. I'll make sure whoever's running your syllabus knows to work you twice, as hard as everyone else in your class. Cole almost smiled. The first real crack of one she'd seen from him. Is that a threat or a promise, Commander? With me, Quinn said, it's usually both. 4 years later, Naval Air Station Lemoore sat baking under a hard California sun, heat shimmering off the tarmac in visible waves, the roar of F divided by a -18s running up on the flight line loud enough to swallow every other sound, within a mile. Quinn Ashford stood at the edge of the ready room, a training syllabus tucked under one arm, watching a new class of nugget aviators file in for their first squadron brief, nervous, eager, trying too hard to look like they weren't either of those things. She had turned down 2 staff assignments, and 1 recruiting billet to take this posting. Instructor pilot. Training command. The job nobody with real ambition was supposed to want, according to every senior officer who tried, gently, to talk her out of it. Because they didn't understand. This wasn't a step down. This was the only place left, where the thing she'd learned 4 years ago, the thing that had nearly cost her everything, and had ultimately saved 211 strangers, could actually be passed on to someone else, before it cost them anything at all. The door at the back of the ready room opened. A tall young man stepped through, flight suit crisp, jaw set in a way that made Quinn's chest tighten, with a recognition that had nothing to do with training records and everything to do with memory. Cole Sutter found her eyes across the room and, for one long moment, neither of them said anything at all. Then he crossed the space between them, came to attention, and offered a salute, so precise it would have made his father proud. Ensign Sutter, reporting for flight training, ma'am. Quinn returned the salute. Let it hold a half-second longer than regulation required. Welcome to the squadron, Ensign, she said. Your father would be proud of you. I intend to make sure you earn every reason for him to be. Cole's composure cracked, just slightly, at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, something steadier and more permanent than that. Yes, ma'am, he said. Outside, on the flight line, the engines of a dozen F divided by a -18s spun up in unison, a sound like thunder finding its voice, and Quinn Ashford turned toward the door, toward the tarmac, toward a class of young pilots, who had no idea, yet how much of what they were about to learn had been paid for years earlier, 34,000 feet above the Cascades, by a woman, who had refused to let a good man's death be written into history as anything other than exactly what it was. The truth. Finally, permanently, the truth.